The ceiling tiles were water-stained and unfamiliar. My mouth tasted like metal and cotton, and when I tried to lift my head, the room tilted sideways in a nauseating spin. Somewhere beyond the curtain surrounding my bed, machines beeped in steady rhythm. A hospital. I was in a hospital, but I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, or when. A nurse appeared through the curtain, her expression shifting from routine to surprise when she saw my open eyes. She asked me questions I struggled to answer through my dry throat. "What's your name? What day is it? Do you know where you are?" I managed my name, Claire Hendricks, but the rest came out confused and uncertain. She left quickly to get a doctor, and I lay there trying to piece together my last clear memory. I'd been at home. It was morning, I think. David had already left for work. Everything after that moment was just blank space, like someone had taken an eraser to the film of my life. Dr. Palmer was a tall woman with kind eyes that held something else beneath the kindness. She examined me carefully, shining lights in my eyes and asking me to follow her finger. Then she asked if I remembered anything about the past 4 days. 4 days. I'd lost 4 entire days of my life, just gone into nothing. She explained that I'd been found unconscious in my car, parked in a grocery store lot 3 towns away. A concerned shopper had called emergency services when they noticed me slumped over the wheel. I'd been brought to County General and had been in and out of consciousness since. Tests had been run, scans completed. Everything looked mostly normal now. But then she asked the question that made my stomach drop. Had anyone at home been notified? Did my family know where I was? I told her, of course they must know. My husband David would have been frantic. He would have called the police, searched everywhere, contacted every hospital within 100 miles. Dr. Palmer's expression shifted into something that looked almost like pity. She explained that when I was brought in, I'd had my purse with my identification, but the emergency contacts in my phone had yielded no results. They'd tried calling the numbers listed, including one labeled David, but the calls went to voicemail. No one had returned their messages. My chest tightened. That didn't make sense. David always answered his phone, especially if it was an unknown number. He was meticulous about that, worried he might miss an important work call. And even if he somehow missed it, he checked his messages obsessively throughout the day. There was no way he wouldn't have called back immediately. I asked to use the phone on the bedside table. My hands shook as I dialed our home number, then David's cell when the house phone rang endlessly without answer. Both times, voicemail. I left messages, my voice cracking. "David, it's me. I'm in the hospital. Please call me back. I need you." Hours passed with no response. The nurses kept checking on me, their faces carefully neutral. Dr. Palmer ordered more tests, wanting to understand what had caused my blackout. I spent the afternoon being wheeled through corridors for scans, while my phone sat silent on the bedside table. Every time I returned to my room, I checked it with desperate hope. Finally, as evening crept in through the window, I called my best friend Rachel. She answered on the 3rd ring, and the sound of her voice made me want to cry. But before I could explain everything, before I could tell her about the hospital and the missing days, she said something that froze the words in my throat. Her voice was cold, clipped in a way I'd never heard from her before. She said she understood why I'd done what I'd done, but she thought I should have at least told people. That leaving without a word was cruel, especially to David. Then she hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone in confusion. I called Rachel back immediately, but she declined the call. I tried my mother next, my heart hammering against my ribs. When she answered, her voice was tight and disappointed. She asked if I was calling to explain myself, to justify abandoning my marriage. I tried to tell her I was in the hospital, that I hadn't left anyone, but she cut me off. She said David had called her 3 days ago, devastated. He'd told her that I'd packed a bag and walked out without explanation. That he'd come home from work to find me gone, some clothes missing, and no note. He'd been beside himself, according to my mother. He'd called everyone we knew, hoping I was safe. My mother's words made no sense. I hadn't packed anything. I hadn't left. I'd been unconscious in a hospital bed while my husband told everyone I'd abandoned him. Why would he do that? Why would he lie? I tried to make my mother understand, but she sighed heavily and said she hoped I'd figure out what I really wanted. I hung up and immediately called my sister, Jennifer. She was always the rational one, the one who listened before judging. But when she answered and heard my voice, she laughed bitterly. She said she'd wondered when I'd finally reach out, when I'd feel guilty enough to start making my rounds of apologies and explanations for what I'd done. I was crying now, trying to explain through tears that I hadn't done anything, that I'd been here in this hospital room, unconscious and alone. Jennifer's voice softened slightly, but then she said David had shown her the security footage from our bedroom. She'd seen me packing a bag, seen me walking out the door, with determination. Security footage. We had cameras in the house, installed last year after a break-in on our street. But I'd never packed a bag. I'd never walked out that door. Unless I had, during those missing hours I couldn't remember. Unless something had happened that I'd somehow blocked out, that my mind had erased completely. After Jennifer hung up, I sat in the darkening hospital room and tried to make sense of it all. Was it possible? Could I have packed a bag and left during those lost hours? Could I have driven to that grocery store parking lot in another town, and then something happened to make me black out? Maybe the doctors had missed something crucial. But that didn't explain why David hadn't come looking for me. Even if he thought I'd left him, even if he was hurt and angry, he would have wanted to know I was safe. He would have filed a missing person report. He would have called the police when I didn't answer my phone for days. Unless he'd wanted me to disappear. The thought came unbidden and terrible, settling into my chest like ice. I pushed it away. But it lingered there, cold and insistent. Why would my husband want me gone? We'd had our problems lately, tensions about money and his long work hours, but nothing that warranted this. Dr. Palmer returned with a police officer in tow. Officer Martinez was young, with a notepad and a concerned expression. He explained that the hospital had called them after my attempts to contact my family raised red flags. He wanted to know if I felt safe at home, if there was any reason I might have left suddenly. I told him everything. About waking up with no memory, about David's lies, about everyone believing I'd abandoned my marriage. Martinez took notes carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he asked if I wanted to press charges against anyone. Charges for what? For lying to my family? For not visiting me in the hospital? He clarified that he meant charges for anything that might have happened at home, before I ended up in that parking lot. His meaning was clear even through the careful phrasing. He thought David might have hurt me. He thought my husband might be the reason I'd lost 4 days of my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something lurking at the edge of my memory. Not images exactly, but feelings. Fear. Panic. The sensation of something being terribly wrong. I'd wake with my heart racing, unable to pin down what had triggered it. The missing days haunted me like a ghost I couldn't see. Dr. Palmer explained that memory loss from head trauma could be temporary. The scans had shown a mild concussion, which explained some of my symptoms. But she also gently suggested that sometimes the brain protects itself by suppressing traumatic memories. Sometimes forgetting is a defense mechanism, a way to survive something unbearable, until we're ready to face it. I didn't want to believe that something unbearable had happened in my own home. I didn't want to think that David, my husband of 6 years, the man I'd built a life with, could be capable of hurting me. But the facts were undeniable. I'd disappeared, he'd lied about it, and nobody had been looking for me. On the morning of my second conscious day in the hospital, David walked into my room. He looked haggard, his shirt wrinkled and his face unshaven. When he saw me sitting up in bed, his expression cycled through surprise, relief, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something that looked almost like fear. He rushed to my bedside, reaching for my hand. I pulled away instinctively, and hurt flashed across his face. He asked where I'd been, his voice breaking. He said he'd been so worried that he'd called everyone trying to find me. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost believed him myself. Almost forgot what my mother and Rachel had told me, about what he'd really said. I asked him why he told everyone I'd left him, why he'd said I'd packed a bag and walked out. David's face went pale, then flushed red. He stammered something about being confused, about not knowing what else to tell people when I vanished. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and his hands trembled as he gripped the bedrail. David sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, running his hands through his hair. He said he'd come home from work 4 days ago and found me gone. Some clothes missing from my closet, my overnight bag not in its usual spot. He'd assumed I'd left, had taken a break from our marriage. He'd been hurt, embarrassed, and had told people what he thought was the truth. But I hadn't packed anything. I told him that, watching his reaction carefully. I said I'd woken up here with no memory of those days, no recollection of leaving or packing or driving anywhere. David nodded along, his expression sympathetic, but something in his eyes remained guarded. Something that didn't match the concern on his face. He was hiding something, lying about something. And we both knew it. I asked about the security footage. Jennifer had mentioned he'd shown her a video of me packing and leaving. David's face changed, hardened somehow. He said the footage must have gotten corrupted. He couldn't find it anymore on the system. A convenient technical failure. One that erased the only evidence of what he claimed had happened. Officer Martinez appeared in the doorway, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. David stood quickly, introducing himself with forced friendliness. The officer asked if they could speak privately, and David shot me a look I couldn't decipher before following Martinez into the hallway. Through the partially open door, I could hear the murmur of their voices, but not the words. They spoke for nearly 10 minutes while I sat alone with my racing thoughts. When David returned, his friendly mask had slipped. He looked angry now, his jaw tight and his eyes hard. He said the police were asking inappropriate questions, implying things about him that weren't true. He said they were trying to turn me against him. Officer Martinez came back in and asked David to wait outside. Once we were alone, he told me they were going to retrieve the security footage from my house. David had refused to provide it voluntarily, claiming it was corrupted, but Martinez had obtained a warrant. Whatever was on those cameras, we'd know by tomorrow. That night, my dreams were vivid and terrifying. I was in our house, in our bedroom, and David was there. But his face was wrong somehow, twisted with an emotion I'd never seen on him before. He was shouting, his words muffled as if I was underwater. I tried to back away, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move properly. In the dream, I reached for something on the nightstand. My phone, maybe, or a weapon. But David was faster, his hands reaching for me. Then everything went dark, and I was falling through empty space with no bottom. I woke up gasping, my hospital gown soaked with sweat, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. A nurse came in to check on me, concerned by my elevated heart rate on the monitors. I told her it was just a nightmare, but we both knew it was more than that. It was a memory trying to break through. Something my mind had buried was clawing its way back to the surface, piece by terrible piece. Dr. Palmer discharged me that morning with instructions to rest and follow up with a neurologist. She gave me a long look as she signed the paperwork, then said quietly that I didn't have to go home if I didn't feel safe. She could help arrange other accommodations, a shelter maybe, somewhere secure. I thanked her, but said I'd stay with my mother. Officer Martinez arrived just as I was gathering my few belongings. He said they'd retrieved the security footage from my house's system. The technicians had recovered the files that David claimed were corrupted. Martinez asked if I wanted to view them here, or if I'd prefer to wait and watch them at the police station. I said here. Now. I needed to know. He set up his laptop on the rolling tray table by my bed. David wasn't present. Martinez had specifically not informed him that the viewing would happen now. He pressed play. On the screen, I watched myself enter the bedroom. I was wearing the same clothes I vaguely remembered putting on that morning, jeans and a blue sweater. I moved normally. No suitcase, no packing. I was just walking through the room, picking up a book I'd left on the dresser. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested I was planning to leave. Then David appeared in the doorway, and even through the silent security footage, I could see we were arguing. His face was red, his gestures aggressive. I backed away from him, toward the camera, and the angle captured my expression clearly. I looked frightened, not angry, not defiant. Scared of my own husband in our own bedroom. The argument escalated quickly. David advanced on me, his finger jabbing in my direction as he shouted words the camera couldn't capture. I held up my hands in a placating gesture, trying to calm him down. But whatever I said only made him angrier. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I watched myself turn away from David, trying to leave the room. But he grabbed my arm, spinning me back around. Even through the grainy footage, I could see his grip was tight enough to hurt. I tried to pull away, and that's when he shoved me. Hard. I stumbled backward, my arms windmilling as I lost my balance. My head struck the corner of the dresser with a sickening impact that no sound could capture, but that I felt in my bones watching it. My body crumpled to the floor, motionless. On screen, David stood frozen, staring down at my collapsed form. For several seconds, he didn't move. Just stood there, watching me bleed onto the carpet. Then he sprang into action, but not to help me. He grabbed my overnight bag from the closet and began frantically stuffing clothes into it. He took items from my dresser drawers, my closet, creating the scene of someone who'd packed and left. The timestamp showed this frantic staging went on for nearly 20 minutes while I lay unconscious. On the footage, David left the room with my packed bag. He returned minutes later, alone, without the bag. He knelt beside my still form, checking for a pulse at my neck. Whatever he felt there must have satisfied him, because he nodded to himself. Then he picked up my phone from where it had fallen near the dresser and slipped it into his pocket. The next part was hardest to watch. David lifted my unconscious body, struggling under my weight. He carried me out of frame, toward the bedroom door. The camera kept recording the empty room. The blood stain on the carpet near the dresser. The chaos of the open drawers. Evidence of violence that David thought he'd explained away with his lies. Officer Martinez fast-forwarded through hours of empty room. Then David reappeared, this time with cleaning supplies. He scrubbed at the bloodstain, shampooed the carpet, tried to erase all evidence that anything had happened. The timestamp showed this was hours after he'd first carried me away. Hours during which I'd been who knows where, unconscious and vulnerable. Martinez stopped the footage and explained what they'd pieced together. David had driven me, unconscious, to a grocery store parking lot in another town. He'd left me slumped in my own car with my purse so I'd eventually be identified, then driven back home in a second vehicle. He'd probably hoped I'd wake up with memory loss, confused about what happened, unable to contradict his story. Or maybe he'd hoped I wouldn't wake up at all. Maybe he'd thought the head injury would be fatal, that I'd die alone in that parking lot, and everyone would believe his grieving husband act. The uncertainty of his intentions made my stomach turn. Either outcome would have served him, would have freed him from our marriage without the mess of divorce. I couldn't speak, couldn't process the enormity of what I'd just watched. My husband, the man I'd loved and trusted, had nearly killed me and then systematically lied to everyone we knew. He'd turned my friends and family against me, made me doubt my own memory and sanity, all to cover up what he'd done. Detective Chen arrived with more information. They'd been investigating David while I recovered, following leads that emerged once they suspected him. What they'd found painted a picture I'd never seen. David had been having an affair for over a year. A woman from his office named Melissa, someone he'd mentioned casually a few times as just a colleague. But she was much more than that. They'd been planning a life together, making arrangements to be together permanently. Except David was the one with money in our relationship. His salary was modest, but I'd inherited a substantial amount from my grandmother 2 years ago. Money that was in my name alone. Money he couldn't access if we divorced. The detective laid it out plainly. David had more to gain from my death than divorce. As my spouse, he'd inherit everything. And if my death looked like an accident, or if I just disappeared after everyone believed I'd left him, he'd be free to build a new life with Melissa using my money. A tidy solution to an inconvenient marriage. David had forgotten about the security cameras in his panic, Martinez explained. Or more likely, he'd remembered them later and tried to delete the footage, but our system backed up to a cloud server he didn't know about. The corrupted files on our home system had been his doing, but the backup copies were safe beyond his reach. That backup had captured everything. It was a small oversight that had unraveled his entire plan. If he'd succeeded in deleting all the footage, it would have been my word against his. And with everyone already believing I'd left him, with no memory of what had actually happened, I would have had nothing. No proof, no support, no way to make anyone believe the truth. I asked what happened now. Martinez explained they were getting a warrant for David's arrest. He'd be charged with attempted murder, assault, and several other crimes. The evidence was clear and damning. There would be a trial, but with that video, the outcome wasn't really in doubt. David was going to prison. Before I left the hospital, I called my mother. I needed her to know the truth, to understand what had really happened. At first, she tried to defend David, saying there must be some misunderstanding. People don't just snap like that, she said. There must have been something that provoked him, pushed him to react. Her words felt like a second betrayal. I told her the police had the security footage, that she could watch it herself if she wanted to. There was no misunderstanding, no provocation that justified what David had done. He'd tried to kill me and then lied about it to everyone. My voice was shaking, but I kept going, making her hear every word, making her understand what her doubt meant. There was a long silence on the line. Then my mother started crying, apologizing through her tears. She said she'd been so sure I'd made a mistake, walked out impulsively. It was easier to believe that than to think someone could do what David had done. She asked if she could come get me, take me home with her. I said yes. Rachel called next, having heard from my mother what had happened. She was sobbing before I even said hello. She apologized over and over for not believing me, for being cold when I'd called from the hospital. David had been so convincing, she said, so heartbroken and worried. She'd seen him at the coffee shop, and he'd shown her texts he claimed were from me, saying I needed space. Those texts had been sent from my phone while I lay unconscious, probably by David himself. More staging, more manipulation to sell his lie. Rachel said she should have known something was wrong, should have trusted her instincts. I'd been her best friend for 10 years. She should have known I wouldn't just disappear without talking to her first. I told her it wasn't her fault. David had fooled everyone, had been convincing because he'd believed his own story. Narcissists were like that, able to lie so smoothly because they'd already justified their actions to themselves. Rachel asked what she could do now, how she could help. I said, just believe me. Just be my friend again. My mother arrived that afternoon to take me home with her. As we walked through the hospital corridors toward the exit, I felt like I was leaving behind more than just a building. I was leaving behind the woman I'd been before. The one who'd trusted too easily, who'd missed the warning signs in her own marriage. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, warier. Detective Chin had advised me not to return to the house I'd shared with David. It was a crime scene now, and besides, it wouldn't be safe. My mother had already arranged to have some of my belongings collected and brought to her place. Everything else could wait. Until after the trial. After David was locked away where he couldn't hurt me again. As we reached the hospital entrance, I saw news vans in the parking lot. Word had gotten out somehow. About David's arrest, about the security footage that proved attempted murder. Reporters called out questions as we passed, but my mother shielded me, guiding me quickly to her car. I kept my head down, saying nothing. By that evening, the story was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then regional outlets, then national. Husband tells everyone wife left him. Security footage shows attempted murder. The headline variations were all similar, all shocking. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all expressing horror and support. I turned it off after an hour, overwhelmed. The public reaction was intense and immediate. David's name and face were plastered across every screen. His office placed him on immediate leave pending investigation. Melissa, his girlfriend, claimed she'd had no idea he was still married, that he'd told her they were already divorced. Whether that was true or just her own attempt to avoid blame, I didn't know. And I didn't care. My mother's house became a refuge from the media circus. She'd always been protective, sometimes overbearingly so, but now I was grateful for it. She fielded calls from reporters, turned away people who showed up at the door, and created a buffer between me and the world's sudden interest in my attempted murder. I spent most of my time sleeping, letting my brain heal. Over the next few days, fragments of memory started coming back. Not all at once, but in pieces, like a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled. I remembered the morning of the attack more clearly now. David and I had been arguing about money. I'd discovered he'd taken $5,000 from our joint account without telling me, and I'd wanted to know why. He'd gotten defensive immediately. Angry that I was questioning him. The argument had escalated fast, his rage disproportionate to the situation. Now I understood why. He'd probably taken that money for Melissa, to pay for the apartment they were planning to share. My questions had threatened his carefully constructed double life, and he'd snapped. Or maybe he'd already been planning to hurt me, and I'd just given him an excuse. I remembered his face as he advanced on me, the cold fury in his eyes. I'd been genuinely afraid in that moment, afraid of someone I thought I knew completely. I'd tried to de-escalate, to calm him down, but nothing I said made any difference. He'd been beyond reason, beyond caring. And then he'd shoved me, and everything had gone dark. David was formally arrested and denied bail. The judge considered him a flight risk and a danger to me. His mugshot showed a different man than the one I'd married. His face was haggard, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Looking at that photo, I felt nothing. No love, no anger, no grief for the marriage that had ended with him trying to kill me. Just emptiness where those feelings used to live. His lawyer tried to spin the narrative, suggesting the shove had been accidental, that David had panicked when I hit my head. But the security footage contradicted everything. The packing of my bags, the disposal of my body in another town, the systematic lying to everyone, the cleaning of evidence. None of that spoke to panic or accident. It spoke to calculated intent. The district attorney was building an airtight case. Attempted murder, kidnapping, evidence tampering. They had the video, they had my medical records, they had testimony from the people David had lied to. My lawyer assured me that David would spend years in prison. Justice would be served, even if nothing could undo what he'd done. My sister Jennifer visited one evening, carrying flowers and barely holding herself together. She cried the moment she saw me, apologizing for not believing me when I'd called from the hospital. David had shown her what he claimed was security footage of me packing, but now she realized it must have been edited or fabricated. She'd trusted him over me, her own sister, and the guilt was eating her alive. I forgave her, because holding on to anger would only hurt me more. Jennifer had been manipulated like everyone else. David had been convincing because he'd had time to prepare his lies, to create supporting evidence. She'd had no reason to doubt him until it was too late. None of us had seen what he was really capable of until he'd already done the unthinkable. Jennifer stayed for hours, helping my mother prepare dinner and sitting with me in comfortable silence when I got tired of talking. Having her there felt like a piece of my life clicking back into place. David had tried to isolate me completely, to turn everyone against me so that no one would question his story. But his plan had failed, and my support system was rebuilding itself, slowly, around me. Linda Reeves, the assistant district attorney, a sharp, precise woman, came to my mother's house to walk me through the timeline as they understood it. David had been planning to leave me for months, but he wanted my inheritance money first. When I'd questioned him about the $5,000, he'd seen an opportunity to solve his problem permanently. After knocking me unconscious, he staged the scene to look like I'd left him. He drove me to that parking lot in my own car, positioning me to look like I'd pulled over and passed out. Then he took an Uber back to where he'd left his car near our house. The Uber driver had already been interviewed, already confirmed. More evidence, brick by brick, building the case against him. Linda explained that David had probably hoped the head injury would kill me, make it look like a medical emergency. If I survived with memory loss, he figured his staged evidence would hold up against my confused recollections. Either way, he'd planned to inherit my money and start over with Melissa. Cold, calculated, and it almost worked. My grandmother had left me $300,000 when she died. It had been sitting in an investment account in my name only, growing steadily. David had always been frustrated that he couldn't touch it, that I'd kept it separate from our joint finances. At the time, I'd told him it was a safety net. Now I understood just how much that decision had saved more than my finances. Linda helped me understand the full shape of the motive. David made decent money, but Melissa was expensive. She liked nice things, nice places. Investigators had found receipts, dinners, hotels, gifts, all paid for by David. He'd been bleeding money to maintain the affair, going deeper into debt. My inheritance represented freedom to him, the ability to live the life he'd chosen, with the woman he'd chosen. It was nauseating. To think I'd almost been killed over money. Not passion, not fear, not even hatred. Just cold financial calculation. David had valued $300,000 more than my life, more than the 6 years we'd spent together, more than any shred of human decency. That realization hurt worse than the physical injuries in some ways. Then Melissa broke her silence. She gave an interview to a local news station, claiming she'd been deceived as much as anyone. She'd believed David was divorced, she said, tearfully facing the camera. He'd told her his ex-wife was difficult and vindictive. She'd had no idea I was still in the picture, still living with him, still believing our marriage was intact. The interviewer pressed her, and Melissa crumbled. My lawyer told me not to watch. I watched anyway. Seeing her face, hearing her voice, it made the betrayal more real somehow. She was pretty in a conventional way, younger than me by several years. In another life, I might have felt jealous, inadequate. But in that moment, I felt only a hollow disgust that David had blown up so many lives for someone so ordinary. The interview backfired. Public opinion turned when people noticed the inconsistencies. She'd mentioned David planning to move into a new apartment with her, something that suggested she knew he wasn't actually divorced yet. The police interviewed her again. Watching her squirm under that scrutiny felt like tiny justice. Dr. Palmer referred me to a trauma therapist named Dr. Sarah Kwan. Our first session was difficult. I struggled to articulate the tangle of emotions inside me: betrayal, fear, anger, grief for the life I'd thought I had. Dr. Kwan listened patiently, taking notes, asking gentle questions. She told me that healing from trauma wasn't linear, that there would be good days and terrible ones. And that was normal. She warned me about the symptoms to watch for: nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting people. I was already experiencing some of them, she said, which was expected given what I'd survived. But with therapy and time, I could process the trauma and reclaim my sense of safety. It wouldn't be quick or easy, but it was possible. I wanted desperately to believe her. My mother attended some of the sessions with me, learning how to support me without being overbearing. She admitted she'd always thought David was perfect for me, successful, charming. She'd missed the warning signs, the small, controlling behaviors, the way he'd gradually pulled me away from the people I loved. She blamed herself. But Dr. Kwan explained that abusers are expert manipulators. Missing the signs doesn't make you complicit. As word spread about what had really happened, people I hadn't heard from in years began reaching out. College friends, former coworkers, cousins I'd lost touch with. They expressed shock and support, saying they'd had no idea. Some admitted they'd thought David was controlling but hadn't wanted to interfere. Others said they'd simply drifted away, because David always seemed to dominate my time. Looking back, I could see exactly how it had happened. He'd complain about my friends, find reasons we couldn't attend gatherings, sulk when I made plans without him. It had been gradual enough that I hadn't recognized it as isolation. I'd thought he just wanted to spend time with me, that his possessiveness was flattering rather than dangerous. Rachel helped me reconnect with the friends I'd lost touch with. She organized a small gathering at my mother's house, just a handful of women I'd been close to before David. We sat in the living room drinking tea and talking, and for a few hours I felt almost normal. Almost like the woman I'd been before, the one who laughed easily and trusted people. That woman was still inside me somewhere. Buried, but not gone. Then the grand jury handed down its indictment. Multiple charges: attempted murder in the first degree, kidnapping, assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm, evidence tampering, filing false reports. Linda Reeves called to tell me the news, her voice triumphant. This was one of the strongest cases she'd seen, she said. David was facing 30 years to life if convicted on all counts. David's lawyer immediately filed motions to suppress the security footage, claiming it violated privacy expectations. But the cameras had been installed in our shared home, with both our knowledge and consent. There was no reasonable expectation of privacy that would exclude them. The judge denied the motion quickly. A small victory, Linda said, that set the tone for how the trial would likely go. I'd have to testify. Linda prepared me for what that would mean, the questions I'd face, seeing David in the courtroom. She warned me his lawyer would try to paint me as unreliable due to my memory loss, would suggest I'd provoked the attack somehow. I needed to stay calm, stick to the facts, let the video speak for itself. The truth was on our side. Then David's mother called my mother's house one evening. I heard my mother's voice change, becoming cold, clipped. She told whoever was calling that I wasn't available and didn't wish to speak with them. After she hung up, she explained it had been David's mother, wanting to explain that her son wasn't a monster, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, to understand how she could defend what her son had done. But the larger part of me knew there was nothing she could say that would matter. David had tried to kill me. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That wasn't something a mother's love could excuse or explain away. My mother had protected me from that call, and I was grateful. David's father sent a letter that arrived a few days later. My mother wanted to throw it away unopened, but I insisted on reading it. The letter was strange, rambling, never quite admitting what David had done, but asking for forgiveness anyway. He wrote about David's difficult childhood, his struggles in school, as if any of that justified attempted murder. I read it once, and then burned it in my mother's fireplace. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, I returned to the house I'd shared with David. The police had released it as a crime scene, and I needed to collect my belongings. Rachel and Jennifer came with me, moral support for what I knew would be difficult. Pulling into the driveway, I felt my chest tighten. My hands went clammy on the steering wheel. Inside, everything looked almost normal, but there were signs. Fingerprint dust on surfaces, the carpet in the bedroom slightly darker where David had scrubbed it, trying to hide my blood. I stood in the doorway of that bedroom, staring at the spot where I'd fallen, and felt dizzy with the memory. Jennifer's hand on my shoulder brought me back to the present. We worked quickly, filling boxes with my clothes, books, personal items. Rachel handled the kitchen, Jennifer the bathroom. I focused on my office, the one room that had been truly mine. My files, my computer, the framed photos of my life before David. Looking at those photos, I could see how my smile had changed over the years of our marriage, becoming smaller, more forced. I hadn't even noticed it happening. In David's office, I found things the police had either missed or deemed irrelevant to the case. Receipts for hotel rooms on dates he'd told me he was working late. Credit card statements showing purchases at jewelry stores I'd never received gifts from. A burner phone hidden in his desk drawer, full of messages to Melissa. Evidence of lies stacked upon lies. A secret life running parallel to the one I'd thought we shared. The messages to Melissa were particularly hard to read. He'd complained about me constantly, calling me controlling and cold. He'd told her he couldn't wait to be free of me, to start their real life together. The most recent messages, sent the day before he'd tried to kill me, talked about his plan being almost ready. It wasn't clear if Melissa had understood what he meant, but the implication was chilling. I boxed up the evidence and gave it to Linda Reeves. She was grateful for it, said it helped establish premeditation even more clearly. David hadn't snapped in a moment of rage. He'd been planning this, fantasizing about my death or disappearance, counting down to the moment he'd be free. Every message was another nail in his coffin, more proof of his guilt. My lawyer advised me to give one statement to the media and then refuse all further interviews. Linda agreed it would help shape the narrative before David's defense team could. We held a brief press conference on my mother's front lawn, cameras and microphones pressed close. I read from a prepared statement, my voice shaking, but clear. I thanked the police, the hospital staff, and everyone who'd supported me. Then I looked directly into the cameras and said that no one should have to experience what I'd gone through. That domestic violence can hide behind a respectable exterior, that abusers are often charming and convincing. That if someone you know suddenly disappears, don't just believe the story you're told. Ask questions, check security footage. Believe victims when they tell you the truth. My voice broke on the last words, but I finished the statement. The response was overwhelming. Domestic violence organizations reached out, wanting me to speak at events or participate in awareness campaigns. Other women shared their own stories of narrow escapes and partners who'd tried to silence them. I wasn't ready for any of it yet, still too raw and broken. But it helped to know that something positive might come from my horror, that my story might save someone else. David's trial was set for 3 months after his arrest. Linda Reeves said that was unusually fast, but the strength of the evidence made a prolonged delay unnecessary. She was confident we'd win, but warned me not to underestimate David's legal team. They were well-funded, probably by his parents, and they'd fight hard. They had to, because the alternative was their client spending decades in prison. I spent those months preparing myself emotionally for the trial. Dr. Kwan and I worked on strategies for managing anxiety in the courtroom, for staying grounded when facing David again. She taught me breathing exercises and visualization techniques. We role-played the testimony I'd have to give, with her playing the aggressive defense attorney. It was exhausting, but necessary. I needed to be ready. My mother wanted to testify as a character witness, to talk about how David had deceived her and the family. Jennifer and Rachel were also on the witness list, along with my coworkers, the Uber driver, hospital staff, and several of David's colleagues. The prosecution was building a comprehensive picture of David's deception and violence. By the time they were done, the jury would see him exactly as he was. The courthouse was surrounded by news vans when we arrived. My mother held my left arm, Rachel my right, as we pushed through the crowd of reporters and cameras. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to engage with the shouted questions. Inside, the courthouse was quieter, calmer. Linda Reeves met us in the hallway, going over last-minute details. She squeezed my hand and told me I was ready. I wasn't sure I believed her. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from watching legal dramas on television. David sat at the defense table in a suit, looking nothing like the man who'd tried to kill me. His hair was neatly cut, his expression composed and serious. When I entered, his eyes found mine, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw hatred there, pure and cold. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced neutrality. Jury selection took most of the first day. Potential jurors were questioned about their views on domestic violence, their ability to be impartial, whether they'd been influenced by the media coverage. Some were dismissed for having strong opinions. Others claimed they could set aside what they'd heard and judge only on the evidence presented. By day's end, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were seated, looking both solemn and curious about the case before them. Linda Reeves delivered an opening statement that was both devastating and clear. She outlined exactly what the evidence would show. David Hendricks had attempted to murder his wife for financial gain. She walked the jury through the timeline, the security footage they'd see, the medical evidence of my injuries. She painted a picture of calculation and cruelty, of a man who'd valued money over the life of his spouse. The jury listened with rapt attention, several taking notes. The defense attorney, a slick man named Robert Carmichael, tried a different approach. He admitted that yes, there had been an altercation. Yes, David had made mistakes in how he'd handled the aftermath. But this wasn't attempted murder, he claimed. This was a tragic accident, followed by panic and poor decisions. David had been frightened when I hit my head, hadn't known what to do. Everything that followed was misguided self-protection, not murderous intent. Carmichael's version of events was so sanitized, so divorced from reality, that I almost couldn't believe he was describing the same incident. But that was his job, I understood. He had to give the jury some version they could believe, one that resulted in a lesser charge or acquittal. He had to create reasonable doubt where none truly existed. It was a performance, and he was skilled at it. On the second day, the security footage was played for the jury. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as everyone watched me backing away from David on screen. Watched him advance and shove me. Watched my head strike the dresser. Several jurors flinched visibly. One woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. The impact was visceral, undeniable. This was not an accident. This was violence. Then they watched David stage the scene, packing my bags while I lay motionless. Watched him check my pulse and carry my unconscious body from the room. The footage continued through his return and his cleaning efforts, erasing evidence. By the time it ended, the courtroom felt like the air had been sucked out of it. Even Carmichael looked shaken, though he recovered quickly when the judge called a brief recess. During the break, Linda told me the footage had landed exactly as she'd hoped. No amount of defense spin could overcome what the jury had just witnessed with their own eyes. David's actions spoke for themselves. She said we were in an excellent position going forward, but we couldn't get overconfident. The defense would still present their case, still try to muddy the waters. We had to stay focused. Consistent. I took the stand on day 3, my legs unsteady as I crossed to the witness box. The bailiff swore me in, and I sat down, my hands gripping the armrests. Linda began with easy questions, establishing who I was, my relationship with David, the morning of the attack. I answered clearly, focusing on her face rather than looking at the jury. Or at David. Keeping my voice steady required every ounce of concentration I had. She asked about the argument that morning, what it had been about. I explained the $5,000 missing from our account, David's defensive reaction, how quickly he'd become enraged. I described trying to de-escalate, trying to calm him, and how he'd advanced on me anyway. Linda asked if I'd been afraid, and I said yes. I'd been terrified of my own husband in that moment. My voice cracked saying it. Then she asked about waking up in the hospital, about discovering everyone believed I'd left. I walked the jury through that nightmare, finding out my family had turned against me, that my husband had lied to everyone. Several jurors were openly sympathetic now, their expressions reflecting horror at what I'd experienced. Linda ended her questions by asking if I'd ever intended to leave my marriage. I looked directly at the jury and said no. Never. Carmichael's cross-examination was brutal, exactly as Linda had warned me. He suggested I'd been angry about the money, that I'd become aggressive first. I calmly denied it, citing the security footage that showed otherwise. He asked about my memory loss, implying I couldn't be trusted to accurately recall events. I pointed out that my testimony matched what the cameras had captured. He was trying to create doubt, but the evidence kept contradicting him. Then he went after my character, asking about arguments David and I had had in the past. Had I ever thrown things? Had I ever screamed at him? I admitted we'd had normal marital disagreements, but never anything physical from either side. Until the day he'd tried to kill me. Carmichael tried to make it sound like our marriage was volatile, but Linda objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most of her objections. He was grasping at straws. Finally, Carmichael asked if I'd ever considered that David's actions might have been motivated by fear and confusion rather than malice. I looked at him steadily and said that packing my bags, driving my unconscious body to another town, and lying to everyone I knew for days wasn't confusion. That was calculation. That was attempted murder. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Carmichael had no more questions. Dr. Palmer took the stand to describe my injuries when I was brought into the hospital. She explained the concussion, the skull fracture, the bleeding on the brain that could have been fatal without treatment. She testified that my injuries were consistent with a blow to the head, exactly as the security footage showed. The defense tried to suggest I could have gotten those injuries another way, but Dr. Palmer shut that down quickly. Medical facts, expert opinion, no room for doubt. A forensic pathologist testified next, explaining that the angle and force of impact shown on the security footage matched my injury pattern perfectly. He'd created diagrams, showing the trajectory of my fall, the point of impact, and the resulting damage. It was clinical and disturbing, seeing my near death reduced to angles and measurements. But it was also definitive. There was no other explanation that fit the evidence as completely. The defense brought their own medical expert, who tried to suggest the concussion could have impaired my memory in ways that made my testimony unreliable. But under Linda's cross-examination, he admitted that memory loss didn't mean false memories, and that my account matched all the objective evidence. His testimony ended up helping the prosecution more than the defense. Carmichael looked frustrated as the expert stepped down. The Uber driver who'd taken David back to his car was a middle-aged man named Ray Jacobson. He testified that he'd picked up a fare from a grocery store parking lot in the middle of a weekday. He'd thought it was odd, a man in business clothes standing alone in an empty lot, but figured maybe his car had broken down. David had been quiet during the ride, staring out the window, seeming distracted. Ray had kept the receipt because David had tipped him in cash, which was unusual enough to remember. When the police contacted him weeks later, he'd checked his records and confirmed the trip. Linda asked if he'd noticed anything strange about David's demeanor. Ray said the man had seemed nervous, kept checking his phone, and had specifically asked to be dropped off a block away from his actual destination. Suspicious behavior that made sense now. The defense couldn't shake Ray's testimony. His records were clear, his memory consistent, and he had no reason to lie. He was just a working man who'd given a stranger a ride, and later discovered that stranger had just dumped his unconscious wife in the very parking lot he'd been picked up from. Ray said it made him sick to think about what he'd unknowingly been part of. Melissa was called as a prosecution witness, though she clearly didn't want to be there. Under oath, she admitted to the affair, to the plans she and David had made together. Linda questioned her carefully about what David had told her about me. Melissa said he'd claimed we were separated, that I was difficult and unreasonable. He'd never mentioned that we were still living together. Never shown any indication he was planning to do anything violent. She insisted she'd been deceived too, but Linda produced text messages. Messages where Melissa had asked David when he'd be free, when they could finally start their life together. Messages where David had replied that he was working on it, that it would be soon. When pressed, Melissa admitted that yes, she'd known the divorce wasn't final yet, that David had been vague about the timeline, but she'd trusted him. She'd wanted to believe they'd be together soon. The defense declined to cross-examine her, which was probably smart. Melissa didn't help their case at all. She confirmed David's motive, his desire to be free of me, his deception. When she left the stand, she wouldn't look at David. Maybe she finally understood the kind of man she'd gotten involved with. Maybe she was just protecting herself. Either way, her testimony had damaged David's defense significantly. Several of David's co-workers testified about his behavior in the days after my disappearance. They described him as seeming distracted, but not particularly distraught. He'd mentioned his wife leaving him in casual conversation, but he hadn't seemed devastated. One woman said she'd thought it was strange how quickly he'd moved on emotionally, how he'd been making plans to move out of our house within days of supposedly losing his marriage. Another colleague testified that David had asked him about selling inherited property, specifically about how estates were handled when someone died without updating their will. The conversation had happened 2 weeks before David tried to kill me. The implication was clear and damning. David had been researching what would happen to my inheritance if I died, planning the financial aftermath of my murder before he'd even committed the act. The defense tried to suggest these were innocent conversations taken out of context, but the timing was too coincidental. Combined with everything else, these testimonies painted a picture of a man planning a future without his wife, not grieving the loss of her. The prosecution was methodically closing every escape route, boxing David in with his own words and actions. David's defense rested on a narrative of panic and poor judgment rather than murderous intent. Carmichael called character witnesses who described David as kind, hardworking, nonviolent. Friends from college testified that he'd always been gentle, that they couldn't imagine him hurting anyone. His boss said he was a valued employee who'd never shown signs of aggression. These testimonies were meant to create doubt about whether David was capable of attempted murder. But Linda's cross-examinations exposed the weakness in this strategy. None of these witnesses had seen David at home, in private, during an argument. None of them could speak to what he was capable of when his carefully maintained public image wasn't at stake. People are capable of things their friends would never believe, Linda said, gently but firmly. The jury nodded along, understanding the point. Everyone has a private self. The defense also tried to present evidence of our marital problems, suggesting the relationship had been troubled on both sides. But they had very little to work with. No police reports, no witnesses to me behaving badly. Nothing substantial. Just vague allegations that our marriage had been under stress, which proved nothing. Lots of marriages have stress. That doesn't justify attempted murder. The prosecution had anticipated this approach and shut it down efficiently. The biggest surprise came when Carmichael announced that David would not be taking the stand in his own defense. This was his legal right, and the judge instructed the jury not to consider it as evidence of guilt. But everyone in that courtroom understood what it meant. David's lawyers knew he couldn't withstand cross-examination. Linda would have destroyed him with his own words, exposing every lie, every contradiction. His silence spoke volumes. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Part of me had wanted to hear David try to explain himself, to justify what he'd done. Part of me wanted to watch him squirm under questioning, to see his carefully constructed facade crack. But another part was grateful I wouldn't have to hear his voice, wouldn't have to watch him perform innocence for the jury. His silence was admission enough. Carmichael rested the defense case quickly after that. They'd done what they could with weak materials. Now it came down to closing arguments and the jury's decision. Linda was confident, but she cautioned me against certainty. Juries were unpredictable, she said. We had a strong case, but you never knew what 12 strangers might decide when they went into that deliberation room together. Linda's closing argument was masterful. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every testimony, building the case brick by brick. She showed the security footage again, asking them to watch David's face as he staged the scene of my departure. That wasn't panic, she said. That was calculation. That was a man executing a plan. She pointed to the Uber receipt, the messages to Melissa, the research about estates. Premeditation, in black and white. She reminded them of my testimony, of waking up in a hospital with everyone believing I'd abandoned my marriage. The cruelty of that. The systematic destruction of my support network while I lay unconscious. She talked about what would have happened if that grocery store shopper hadn't noticed me, if I died in that parking lot. David would have inherited everything, started his new life with Melissa, and gotten away with murder. Only luck and technology had stopped him. Linda's voice was strong and clear as she concluded. She told the jury that attempted murder was the only charge that fit the facts, that anything less would be a miscarriage of justice, would say that you can try to kill your spouse for money as long as you stage a good scene afterward. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth was undeniable. Now they had the power to hold David Hendricks accountable for what he'd done. Carmichael's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. He admitted David had made terrible mistakes, had handled the situation in the worst possible way. But mistakes aren't murder, he said. Panic isn't premeditation. He asked the jury to consider that David might have truly believed I was leaving him, that the packing of bags and the lies might have come from confusion and fear rather than calculation. It was a tough sell given the evidence, and his voice lacked conviction. He tried to poke holes in the timeline, suggesting there were gaps in the prosecution's case. But there weren't. Not really. Everything fit together too neatly, too perfectly. He suggested that my memory loss meant my testimony was unreliable, but the security footage corroborated everything I'd said. He was going through the motions, fulfilling his duty to provide his client with a defense, but there was nothing he could say that would erase what we'd all seen on that video. His final plea to the jury was to consider the consequences of their verdict carefully. A man's life hung in the balance, he said. They shouldn't rush to judgment. They should examine every piece of evidence with skepticism. But as he sat down, the courtroom felt heavy with the knowledge that his arguments had fallen flat. The jury's expressions were skeptical of him, not the evidence. This wasn't reasonable doubt. This was just doubt for doubt's sake. The jury was sent to deliberate just after lunch on the trial's 8th day. Linda said we should prepare for a wait, that juries could take days to reach a verdict in serious cases. My mother, Rachel, Jennifer, and I sat in a private room the court had provided, drinking terrible coffee and trying not to watch the clock. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity. I couldn't eat, could barely sit still. Everything came down to 12 strangers and their assessment of my nightmare. 3 hours into deliberations, we got word the jury had a question. They wanted to review the security footage again. Linda said this was good, that it meant they were taking their duty seriously, examining the evidence closely. They watched it twice more in the jury room, according to the bailiff. I imagined them dissecting every frame, discussing what they saw. The thought made me nauseous with anxiety. Then we waited more. 4 hours. 5. The courthouse began to empty as evening approached. Staff going home, reporters camping outside for the verdict. Linda ordered food we didn't eat. My mother held my hand, not saying anything, just being there. Jennifer paced. Rachel checked her phone compulsively. And we waited. Waited for 12 people to decide if what happened to me counted as attempted murder or just an unfortunate accident. Just before 7 that evening, we got word the jury had reached a verdict. My heart hammered so hard I thought I might pass out. Linda gripped my shoulders, told me to breathe, reminded me that we'd done everything right. The evidence was on our side. But I couldn't shake the fear that somehow, impossibly, David might walk free. That his lawyers had created just enough doubt. That the system might fail me the way he had. The courtroom filled quickly, everyone retaking their positions. David was brought in, his expression tense and pale. The jury filed in, none of them looking at him. Linda squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that not looking at the defendant often meant guilty. I wanted to believe her. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The forewoman stood and said yes, they had. My vision tunneled, everything going distant and strange. Guilty on all counts. The words took a moment to register. Guilty of attempted murder in the 1st degree. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. Guilty of evidence tampering. Guilty. 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 Every single charge. The courtroom erupted in noise, people talking and crying. My mother sobbed beside me. Rachel grabbed my other hand. And I just sat there, numb with relief so powerful it felt like drowning. David's face crumbled when he heard the verdict. All his careful composure shattered in an instant. He turned to look at me, and what I saw in his eyes was pure hatred. Not remorse, not shame, just rage that he'd been caught, that his plan had failed. He said something to Carmichael, who shook his head firmly. Security moved closer, as if expecting David to lunge or run, but he just slumped in his chair, defeated. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. She remanded David to custody immediately, with no bail. As the officers came to take him away, he twisted around to look at me one more time. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the noise. It might have been an apology. It might have been a threat. I'd never know. And I realized with sudden clarity that I didn't care. He was nothing to me now. Linda hugged me, professional boundaries momentarily forgotten in the victory. We'd won. Justice had been served. David would spend decades in prison for what he'd done. The system had worked. The evidence had been believed. And I hadn't been dismissed or doubted. After everything, after nearly dying and being branded a runaway wife, the truth had finally, fully emerged, and everyone had seen it for what it was. 2 weeks later, we returned to court for sentencing. This time, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement, to tell the judge and everyone present what David's actions had cost me. I'd written and rewritten the statement a dozen times, struggling to capture the scope of damage in a few minutes of speech. How do you explain the loss of trust, of safety, of your ability to believe people mean you no harm? I spoke about waking up in the hospital, confused and alone, about discovering my family had turned against me, that my friends thought I'd abandoned my marriage, about the weeks of therapy, the nightmares, the hypervigilance that made normal life feel impossible. I spoke about the woman I'd been before David tried to kill me, and the woman I was now, changed irrevocably by his violence and betrayal. My voice shook but never broke. I wanted him to hear every word. I ended by saying I was grateful to be alive, grateful that justice had prevailed, but I would never be the same. David had tried to take everything from me and had very nearly succeeded. The only thing he'd failed to take was my life itself, and that was only because of luck and the chance observation of a stranger. I hoped the court would consider that when deciding his sentence. Then I sat down, exhausted and relieved it was over. Judge Harrison was a stern woman who'd presided over the trial with fairness and no-nonsense efficiency. She addressed David directly, her voice cold and precise. She said she'd seen many cases in her years on the bench, but few as calculated and cruel as this one. David had tried to murder his wife for financial gain, then systematically destroyed her support network while she lay unconscious. The security footage showed premeditation. The evidence showed planning. And his lies showed an utter lack of remorse. She sentenced him to 40 years in prison without possibility of parole for 25 years. The maximum allowable under the law for the charges he'd been convicted of. She said she wished she could sentence him to longer, that his actions warranted it, but this would have to suffice. David showed no reaction to the sentence. He just stared straight ahead as if disconnected from the proceedings. Maybe he was in shock. Maybe he'd already accepted his fate. I didn't care which. Additional penalties included restitution for my medical bills and therapy costs, though Linda said we probably wouldn't see much of that money. David didn't have it, and prison wages were minimal. But the money didn't matter. The sentence mattered. 40 years meant David would be an old man before he breathed free air again. It meant he'd lost everything, just as he'd tried to make me lose everything. The justice wasn't perfect, but it was real. We left the courthouse together, my mother and sister flanking me, Rachel just ahead running interference with the reporters. They shouted questions, but I had nothing more to say. I'd said everything that mattered in that courtroom. Now I just wanted to go home, to begin the next phase of healing, the phase where I rebuilt my life without David's shadow hanging over everything, where I learned to trust again, to feel safe again, to be myself again. The sunlight outside was bright and warm. Spring had arrived while I'd been consumed with the trial, and the trees were blooming. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, just breathing it in. Fresh air, freedom, safety, all the things I'd almost lost forever, all the things David had tried to take from me. But I'd survived. I was still here, still breathing, still fighting. And he was locked away where he could never hurt anyone again. Rachel linked her arm through mine as we walked toward the parking lot. She said something about getting lunch, about celebrating, but I was barely listening. I was thinking about the future, about the blank canvas my life had become. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Everything had been taken from me, but that also meant I could rebuild however I wanted. I could become whoever I chose to be, unshackled from the past and the marriage that had nearly killed me. I filed for divorce the day after sentencing. Under the circumstances, it was uncontested and expedited. David's lawyer advised him not to fight it, and surprisingly, he didn't. Maybe he finally understood that he'd lost everything. Maybe he just wanted to make one thing easy after making everything else so hard. Whatever his reasons, the divorce was finalized within 2 months. I kept my maiden name, something I'd considered changing back to anyway. Another piece of David erased from my life. The division of assets was straightforward. The house went on the market immediately. I couldn't imagine ever living there again. Couldn't imagine sleeping in the room where I'd almost died. My lawyer ensured I received my full share of the marital assets, and more importantly, my inheritance remained entirely mine. The money David had killed for, he would never touch. I moved it into new accounts he could never access, protected behind layers of legal safeguards. Signing the final divorce papers felt surreal. 6 years of marriage ended with a few signatures and a judge's stamp. But those 6 years hadn't been real anyway. I was coming to understand that now. They'd been a performance, a lie I'd believed because I'd wanted to believe it. The real David had been hiding underneath the whole time, waiting for the moment when my usefulness ended and my value became purely financial. I was grateful to be free of him, and free of that fiction. Dr. Kwan continued working with me through the months after the trial. We processed the trauma layer by layer, addressing the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting people. She explained that healing wasn't linear, that I'd have good weeks and terrible weeks, and both were normal. Some days I felt strong and capable. Other days I could barely get out of bed, crushed under the weight of what had happened. Both versions were valid parts of recovery. She helped me understand that the relationship had been abusive long before that final violent act. David's controlling behavior, his isolation tactics, his subtle put-downs and criticisms, all of it had been abuse. I'd normalized it because it happened gradually, because he was charming to others, because I'd loved him. But love doesn't excuse abuse. It never does. Understanding that helped me stop blaming myself for not seeing it sooner, for not leaving before it escalated to attempted murder. Group therapy also helped, sitting with other survivors of domestic violence, hearing their stories, sharing mine. Realizing I wasn't alone, wasn't uniquely broken or damaged. We were all rebuilding ourselves, all learning to trust again, all carrying scars visible and invisible. The women in that group understood things my family and friends couldn't. They didn't need me to explain why I sometimes panicked in enclosed spaces, or why loud male voices made me flinch. They just knew. Rachel threw me a small party 6 months after the trial. She called it a freedom celebration, a way to mark my new beginning. She invited friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage to David, women I'd been close to in college and grad school. At first, it was awkward, explaining where I'd been, what had happened. But then someone suggested we just not talk about David at all. This was about the future, not the past. And the evening transformed into something almost normal. We ate too much food and drank wine and laughed about silly things. Old inside jokes surfaced. Stories from our 20s when we'd been young and reckless. For a few hours, I felt like the woman I'd been before David, before the isolation and control had reshaped me into someone smaller and quieter. That woman wasn't gone. She'd been buried, suppressed, but not destroyed. She was still there, waiting to reemerge. By the end of the night, I'd made plans to meet various friends for coffee, lunch, museum visits. My social calendar, empty for so long, began to fill with normal activities and normal friendships. People who valued me for myself, not for what I could provide them. People who didn't need me to be smaller to make themselves feel bigger. It was strange and wonderful, this rediscovery of connection and community. My employer had been understanding about my extended leave, but eventually I needed to return to work. I was a graphic designer, freelance before my marriage, but David had encouraged me to take a stable office job with benefits. Going back after everything felt strange. My coworkers knew what had happened, had followed the trial. They welcomed me back with careful kindness, not quite knowing how to act around me. I was the woman who'd almost been murdered. That identity followed me, whether I wanted it to or not. But slowly, work became normal again. Projects piled up, deadlines loomed, office politics continued their petty dramas. I was just another employee again, not a victim, not a news story. Just Claire, the senior designer who did good work and met her deadlines. That anonymity was precious. At work, I could be defined by my skills rather than my trauma. It was a gift I hadn't known I needed until I had it. I even took on new clients, started rebuilding my freelance portfolio on the side. David had discouraged my freelance work, said it took too much time away from him. But it had been my passion, the work I loved most. Returning to it felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. My designs got stronger, bolder. I took risks I wouldn't have taken before. Surviving attempted murder gives you perspective on what risks actually matter. I found a new apartment across town, far from the house I'd shared with David. It was smaller but bright, with large windows and hardwood floors. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, choosing every piece myself. No compromises. No accommodating someone else's taste. This was my space, reflecting only me. I hung my own art on the walls, arranged books on shelves by color rather than any logical system, left dishes in the sink if I felt like it. Small freedoms that felt revolutionary. My mother helped me move in, along with Rachel and Jennifer. We made a day of it, ordering pizza and christening each room with stories and laughter. My mother cried a little when we finished, seeing me settled and safe in a space that David couldn't touch, could never enter. She said she'd been so afraid she'd lost me. First to his control, then to death. Having me here, alive and building a new life, was more than she'd hoped for during those dark hospital days. That first night alone in the new apartment, I didn't sleep much. Not from fear or nightmares, but from the strangeness of it all. This was my life now. Single, starting over, 32 years old and rebuilding from rubble. It should have felt devastating. Instead, it felt like possibility. Like the future spreading out before me, undefined and full of potential. I could become anyone, do anything. I was free in a way I hadn't been in years. And so the days kept moving, even when I wasn't sure they would. A year after David tried to kill me, I woke up thinking about that morning. How I'd gotten dressed with no idea it might be my last day. How I'd argued with him about money, not knowing that argument would end with me unconscious and bleeding. How close I'd come to dying in a parking lot, anonymous and alone. The weight of it hit me hard, and I spent the morning crying into my coffee, overwhelmed by everything I'd survived. But Dr. Kwan had prepared me for this. Anniversary reactions were normal, expected even. The body remembers trauma even when the mind tries to move forward. She'd suggested I mark the day intentionally, create a ritual that acknowledged the past while celebrating survival. So I did. I visited the hospital where I'd woken up, found the nurse who'd first seen me conscious, and thanked her. She remembered me, said she'd followed the trial, and hugged me tight. Then I met my mother, sister, and Rachel for dinner. We toasted survival, resilience, and the truth coming to light. We didn't talk about David. We talked about plans, dreams, futures. About the gallery show I was planning for my design work. About my mother's new hobby of pottery. About Rachel's promotion. Normal, forward-looking things. The past had happened and couldn't be changed. But the future was ours to shape, and I was determined to shape mine into something beautiful. 18 months after sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through the district attorney's office. It was from David, written from prison. My first instinct was to burn it unopened, but curiosity won. I showed it to Dr. Kwan first, and we decided together that I could read it if I felt ready. I did, though my hands shook opening the envelope. Inside was 3 pages of David's familiar handwriting, and the content was shocking in its self-delusion. He didn't apologize. Not really. He said he'd been under tremendous pressure, that things had gotten out of hand. He claimed he'd never actually wanted to hurt me, that it had been an accident that spiraled into panic. The letter read like he'd convinced himself of an alternate history, one where he was the victim of circumstance rather than a would-be murderer. He asked if I'd consider visiting him, if we could talk. The audacity was breathtaking. I laughed reading it, a harsh sound that surprised me. This letter proved what Dr. Kwan had said about narcissists, their inability to truly accept responsibility. David had 2 years in prison to reflect on what he'd done, and he'd used that time to construct a narrative where he wasn't the villain. I wrote back exactly 3 words. No, don't write again. Then I burned his letter in my kitchen sink, watching the lies turn to ash. I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter, wanting to turn my experience into something helpful. At first, I just answered phones and sorted donations, but eventually the director asked if I'd be willing to speak with residents, share my story as proof that survival and recovery were possible. I was nervous, but I agreed. Standing in front of a group of women who'd fled their own dangerous situations, I told them about David, the security footage, the trial, the rebuilding. I showed them that the other side existed. The response was overwhelming. Women approached me afterward, crying, thanking me. They said it helped to see someone farther along in the journey, to know that the numbness and fear eventually gave way to something else. I started speaking regularly, becoming an unofficial peer counselor. It was hard, reliving my trauma to help others process theirs. But it was also healing in ways I hadn't expected. My pain had purpose now. My survival meant something beyond just myself. The shelter director eventually asked if I'd consider joining the board. They needed people who understood domestic violence from the inside, who could advocate for survivors with authentic voices. I said yes. It felt right, using what had happened to me to help create change, to improve systems, to save others from similar fates. David had tried to silence me permanently. Instead, I'd found my voice, and I was using it louder than ever. 2 years after the trial, I barely recognized the woman I'd been in that marriage. I'd built an entire life David couldn't touch or diminish. My freelance design business was thriving. I'd had a solo show at a small gallery that sold out. I'd made new friends who knew me only as Claire, not as the woman who'd almost been murdered. The past was part of me, but no longer defined me. I'd integrated it, learned from it, and moved forward. I even went on a few dates, tentatively testing my ability to trust men again. Most didn't go anywhere, which was fine. I wasn't looking for a relationship so much as proof that I could still connect with people, could still be vulnerable without being destroyed. One man I saw a few times asked about the scar on my head, barely visible under my hair. I told him the truth, and he didn't run. He didn't pity me either, just listened and accepted it as part of my history. We didn't work out romantically, but his reaction showed me I could tell my story without it consuming me. My mother said I seemed lighter, happier than she'd seen me in years. She was right. The weight of David's control, his violence, his lies had lifted. I'd carried it through the trial and the first year of recovery, but gradually I'd set it down. It would always be part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. I was the woman who'd survived, yes, but I was also the woman who'd rebuilt, who'd found purpose, who'd refused to let attempted murder be the defining moment of her life. And yet, looking back, I understood something with absolute clarity. Without that security camera, I would have had nothing. No proof. No way to contradict David's lies. Everyone had believed him so readily because he was convincing, charming, seemingly heartbroken. If it had been just my word against his, my fractured memory against his carefully staged evidence, I might never have gotten justice. I might have been blamed for disrupting my own life, accused of attention-seeking, of instability. The camera had saved me in more ways than one. I thought about that often when I spoke at the shelter or worked with survivors. How many women had no proof, no evidence, just their own stories against their abusers' denials? How many had been disbelieved, dismissed, told they were overreacting or misremembering? The justice system had worked for me, but I'd had the extraordinary advantage of video evidence that couldn't be disputed or spun. Most survivors didn't have that, and they deserved belief anyway. Their stories mattered even without cameras capturing the abuse. I'd become an advocate for believing survivors, for taking reports seriously even without perfect evidence. Because David had taught me that abusers are master manipulators, that they fool everyone, that they construct elaborate lies. And victims are often isolated, traumatized, dismissed as unreliable. The system needed to change, needed to better protect people before it escalated to attempted murder. I'd been lucky. Not everyone was. That reality drove my activism forward, fueled my determination to help create change. I learned through Linda that Melissa had moved out of state shortly after the trial. The police investigation had cleared her of direct involvement in David's plan, but her reputation was destroyed. She'd lost her job, her friends, been harassed online. In some ways, she was a victim too, manipulated by David's lies. In other ways, she'd been willfully blind to red flags, choosing to believe what was convenient rather than questioning his story. I felt neither sympathy nor satisfaction about her fate, just a vague hope that she'd learned something. Rachel mentioned seeing something about Melissa on social media, a vague post about lessons learned and moving forward. Apparently, she'd started over somewhere new, under a slightly different name. I didn't look for her, didn't follow her. She was irrelevant to my healing, a footnote in the larger story of David's betrayal. What mattered was that she was gone from my orbit, no longer a factor in my life or my recovery. She could reckon with her own choices in her own time. The whole situation had taught me that there were no truly innocent bystanders in abuse. People either helped or they didn't. They either questioned suspicious stories or they accepted them at face value. Melissa had chosen acceptance because it served her interests. My friends and family had eventually chosen to question, to investigate. That difference had meant everything. I surrounded myself now with people who asked questions, who looked beneath surfaces, who believed survivors. Those were the people worth keeping. Dr. Kwan eventually asked if I'd forgiven David. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Forgiveness felt like it required something I didn't have and didn't want to develop. It suggested a letting go that implied David deserved my grace. But I had moved past him, which wasn't quite the same thing. I didn't hate him anymore. Didn't spend energy on anger or thoughts of revenge. I was simply done with him. He was irrelevant now. She explained that there were different kinds of peace. I didn't have to forgive him to be free of him. I just had to stop letting him occupy space in my head and heart. Stop giving him power over my emotions and my choices. In that sense, I'd achieved peace. I rarely thought about David anymore, except when my advocacy work brought up the memories. He was a cautionary tale, a closed chapter, a thing that had happened rather than a thing that was still happening. That felt like enough. The trauma had changed me, reshaped me in ways both visible and invisible. I was warier now, more cautious about who I let close. But I was also stronger, more certain of my own worth and my boundaries. I knew what I wouldn't accept, what I'd walk away from. Those lessons had come at a terrible cost, but they were mine now, part of my foundation. David had tried to destroy me, and instead, he'd refined me into someone harder to hurt, harder to manipulate, someone who knew her own power. 3 years after waking up in that hospital bed, I sat in my apartment surrounded by friends celebrating my birthday. Rachel had organized it, inviting my small but solid circle of people I trusted. My mother was there, Jennifer and her family, a few friends from the shelter, some design colleagues. We ate cake and laughed, and nobody mentioned David or the trial or any of it. This was just a birthday party, normal and joyful and unremarkable in the best way. Later, after everyone left, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights. I thought about the woman I'd been 4 years ago, married to a man planning to kill her, oblivious to the danger in her own home. That woman felt like a stranger now. I'd become someone entirely different through the crucible of survival. Someone I actually liked, respected even. The journey had been hell, but the destination was somewhere I could live with. Somewhere I could maybe even be happy. I still had bad days, anniversaries and triggers that sent me spiraling into anxiety. But those days were rarer now, further apart. Most days were just days, filled with work and friends and small pleasures. The kind of normal existence I'd taken for granted before David tried to take it away. That normalcy felt precious now, something to protect and nurture. I'd built this life from nothing, from the ashes of my marriage and the trauma of attempted murder. It was mine, and it was enough. The security camera footage had been my salvation, the undeniable proof that exposed David's lies. Without it, everything would have been different. His story would have stood unchallenged. My friends and family would have continued believing I'd abandoned my marriage. I might have been written off as unstable, troubled, unreliable. The camera had captured the truth, when no human witness was present, when even my own memory had failed me. It had been the silent observer that changed everything. I thought about that reality often. How many people didn't have that evidence, that proof? How many domestic violence victims were disbelieved because their abusers were charming, because the abuse happened behind closed doors, because physical evidence was lacking? My case had gone viral partly because of the dramatic irony, the husband who lied until technology proved the truth. But most cases weren't that clear-cut. Most survivors struggled to be believed at all. That inequity haunted me. So I used my platform, small as it was, to advocate for change, for better police training, for systems that believed survivors first and questioned them less, for resources and support for people trying to escape dangerous relationships. My story had a resolution that many didn't get. Justice had been served in a way that was rare and precious. I felt obligated to use that outcome to help others who weren't as fortunate, to make some meaning from the nightmare I'd survived. 4 years after David tried to murder me, I could finally say I was truly happy. Not just surviving or coping or healing, but genuinely happy with the life I'd built. I had work I loved, friends who supported me, purpose that mattered. I'd turned my trauma into advocacy, helping other women escape and heal from their own dangerous relationships. The woman David had tried to silence had found her voice, and was using it to help others find theirs. That irony wasn't lost on me. Sometimes people asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if that grocery store shopper hadn't noticed me that day. If I died in that parking lot, and David had gotten away with it. The thought was chilling, but also clarifying. I'd come so close to becoming a statistic. Another woman killed by her intimate partner. Another cautionary tale. Instead, I'd become a survivor, a voice, an advocate. The difference was luck and technology, nothing more. But what I did with that second chance was entirely up to me. I chose to move forward. To build rather than remain broken. To help rather than hide. David had tried to erase me, to make me disappear so he could start over with someone new, and my money. He'd failed. I was still here, stronger and more certain of who I was than I'd ever been. The security camera had revealed his lies, but I had done the harder work of rebuilding afterward. That rebuilding was ongoing, would always be ongoing. But I was no longer afraid of it. I was no longer afraid of anything.